Axe murder-suicide of the Beetle family. On December 11th, 1782, 38-year-old Lydia Beetle and her four children, Ansel, 11, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, 6, were brutally killed with an axe by 52-year-old William Beetle, the patriarch of their family. Born in 1730, William Beetle was raised during the peak of the Georgian era in Britain. In his youth, he built a reputation for integrity, good character, and honesty within the business circles of London. During this time, he began attending Diaz clubs and openly embraced a moral and rational view of God in the physical world. Beetle was also noted for his small stature and striking, expressive features, as well as for his strong, stubborn opinions and introspective intellect. After achieving financial success in Britain, 32-year-old William Beetle moved to the colonies in 1762, settling first in Stratford, Connecticut, before relocating to Derby and then Fairfield. In each town, he opened country stores that generated significant profits, helping him ascend the colonial social ladder. In 1770, he married Lydia Lothrop, an affluent member of the pre-revolutionary Connecticut elite who was 20 years his junior. The couple began their family with the birth of their only son, Ansel, in 1771, followed by their first daughter, Elizabeth, the next year. With their two children, the Beetles moved to Wethersfield, Connecticut, where they opened a new country store in 1772. Between 1774 and 1776, they welcomed two more daughters, Lydia and Mary, and established a prosperous life in Wethersfield. William Beetle became incredibly wealthy, surpassing many local merchants and businessmen in net worth. Lydia Beetle played a crucial role in helping her husband further integrate into the elite social circles of Connecticut and build valuable community connections. The Beetles' son, Ansel, appeared to be on a path to a promising future in Connecticut. Born into a high-ranking social pedigree due to his mother's connections and his father's successful business, he seemed poised to surpass his father's position and become an influential member of the local business community and colonial power structure. As tensions between the British and the colonists escalated into war, anxiety about the value of continental currency increased. The uncertainty surrounding the ability of Americans to break free from Britain raised questions about the currency's worth. Would it retain any value, or would everything change? Despite laws designed to protect the value of continental currency, the citizens enduring the revolution grew increasingly fearful. This panic led to soaring prices for goods across the colonies, reflecting the turmoil of the times. Beetle, however, was among the few who adhered to the law and did not raise his prices, which quickly led to a decline in his wealth. From 1776 to 1780, he was consumed by the fear of his family's diminishing status in society as the war between the rebel colonists and British forces continued. In March 1780, the newly formed United States Congress enacted a law that devalued continental currency to 1/40th of the dollar's face value, meaning that $40 were now equivalent to just $1, a significant drop in worth. This drastic change was a devastating blow to American merchants, traders, and shopkeepers, many of whom stopped accepting continental currency. Despite this, Beetle continued to accept it at face value, yet found himself trapped as its worth plummeted. Having been accustomed to a life of means, Beetle was horrified at the prospect of becoming one of the common people with limited resources. He had always viewed himself as above the ordinary, yet also considered himself a man of reason. He faced bankruptcy due to his support of merchants affected by the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party and the losses incurred from the war. Despite his financial struggles, Beetle maintained his commitment to the law regarding continental currency, refusing to raise his prices or collect on debts owed to him. He wrote to his friend Colonel John Chester, sharing his financial difficulties over several letters during the Revolution. In these correspondences, Beetle expressed his concerns about the wealth and well-being of his family, fearing the rapid decline of his place in society due to his diminishing prosperity. In one of his letters, Beetle expressed his despair regarding death and contemplated that he could save his family from the humiliation of poverty by ending his own life along with his children's. His writings consistently focused on avoiding destitution without resorting to raising prices in his business. Beetle acknowledged that his death would not truly spare his family. Rather, his children would have to grapple with the knowledge of his failures and would be left to confront the consequences of his shortcomings. Although this subject alarmed Chester, he had no idea that Beetle would act on such thoughts. He also considered whether it would be kinder to murder his wife or to leave her alive, allowing her the chance to remarry and escape the shame of his failures. William Beetle was determined to hide his pain from others, so he continued to focus on his work as a merchant and maintain the appearance of wealth and a happy family life. He accepted continental currency, sold his goods, and attended social events with his wife and friends. However, beneath this facade, Beetle began to devise a grim plan to kill his wife and children. Between 1780 and 1782, he rehearsed this plan, selecting a specific knife for the act and keeping a small axe in the master bedroom for easy access. He would wait until his wife and unsuspecting children were asleep, then enter their bedrooms, standing over their beds to observe them. He did this for two morbid reasons. First, to ensure he could position himself properly when the time came to act, and second, to gauge any feelings of remorse or doubt. Unfortunately, he felt nothing. In a letter to Chester, he confessed that he had no hesitation about his decision. He believed it was the right thing to do to save his family from the uncertainties of poverty and the future of America. On the evening of December 10th, 1782, William Beetle and his wife Lydia hosted some guests. Mr. Beetle appeared to be in good spirits and cheerful, trying unsuccessfully to persuade his guests to stay when they prepared to leave around 9 p.m. In the early hours of the next morning, December 11th, William woke the household maid to inform her that Mrs. Beetle was unwell and sent her to fetch the family doctor, Dr. Joseph Farnsworth. Once the unsuspecting maid had left for the doctor's home, Beetle entered his sleeping wife's room. He picked up the axe he had kept nearby and struck Lydia twice in the head. He then pulled her to the side of the bed, her head and arm hanging off, and slit her throat with a carving knife, ensuring her blood collected in a bowl to avoid staining the sheets. After gently covering her face with a handkerchief, he moved down the hall to the children's bedroom. There he killed his three daughters, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, by crushing their heads with the axe before dragging their bodies onto the wooden floor to cut their throats. Once he had finished with his daughters, Beetle turned to his son, Ansel, and killed him in the same brutal manner, leaving the boy's body in his bed. He abandoned the axe in the children's room and descended to the ground floor, with the bloodied knife still in hand, leaving a trail of bloody footprints throughout the house. He sat down in a Windsor chair in the parlor, placed the knife on a nearby table, and propped his elbows on the arms of the chair. Then he raised a pair of flintlock pistols to his temples and pulled the triggers. With two flashes from the guns, William Beetle took his own life, having killed 6 people in a matter of minutes, including himself, thus becoming one of the first family annihilators in the American colonies. The Beetle family's murder-suicide sent shockwaves through Britain and the emerging American nation. The incident was sensationalized in newspapers, infuriating and horrifying all who learned of William Beetle's heinous acts against his wife and children. The public outrage led to a swift and unceremonious burial for the perpetrator. In the months leading up to the murders, Lydia had experienced disturbing dreams in which she saw her children dead from violence. Unfortunately, she shared these dreams with her husband, and William interpreted them as a sign from heaven that his sinister plans were justified in God's eyes. William's body was discarded from a window of his house, then dragged by sled to the riverside, thrown into the water, and buried between the low and high water marks. Isaac Lothrop, the executor of the Beetle estate, covered the funeral expenses for Lydia and her 4 children. The 5 victims of William Beetle were laid to rest together in Wethersfield Cemetery. The Aramoana massacre took place on November 13, 1990, in the small coastal town of Aramoana, New Zealand. David Gray, a 33-year-old unemployed resident, began shooting people indiscriminately with a scoped semi-automatic rifle following a verbal altercation with his neighbor. He targeted both neighbors and a visiting family, resulting in the deaths of 13 individuals, including local police sergeant Stuart Guthrie, one of the first responders to the incident. The following day, after a thorough search of the area, police officers from the anti-terrorist squad, now known as the Special Tactics Group, found Gray and shot him dead as he exited a house while firing his weapon. This incident remains the deadliest mass shooting in New Zealand's history. The massacre began on November 13th at 7:30 p.m. when Gray confronted his neighbor Gary Holden over one of Holden's daughters wandering onto his property. Following this altercation, Gray went into his home, grabbed a Norinco 84S semi-automatic rifle, stepped outside, and shot Holden dead. Nearby, 3 young girls were present: Holden's daughters, Chiquita and Jasmine, and Rewa, the adopted daughter of his girlfriend Julianne Bryson. As Gray entered Holden's property, the girls ran into Holden's house. He quickly found Chiquita and shot her in the left arm and chest with a Squires and Bingham .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, with the bullet becoming lodged in her abdomen. Injured, Chiquita fled past her father's body to Bryson's house, while Gray set fire to the Holden residence. Realizing that Rewa and Jasmine were still inside, Bryson drove her van to the burning house with Chiquita in an effort to rescue the girls. As they passed, Gray fired at the van, which was near the now flaming house. Gray began shooting indiscriminately, aiming at a utility vehicle filled with locals who had stopped to help after noticing the Holden house ablaze. He first shot Vanessa Percy as she fled down the street in fear, then killed 2 young boys, Leo Wilson and Dion Percy. Their sister Stacy suffered severe abdominal injuries. Next, Ross Percy, the children's father, who had been driving them home after a day of fishing when they spotted the fire, was shot, followed by Aleki Tali, who had also been fishing with them that day. Gray then entered the home of Tim Jameson, killing him and another elderly resident, former Green Island Mayor Vic Krimp. His next victim was James Dixon, who was searching for his dog. When James's mother, Helen Dixon, and neighbor Chris Cole came outside to investigate the commotion, Gray shot at them, wounding Cole, who was in a phone booth trying to call the police, and forcing Helen to dive for cover. Recently having had a hip replacement, Helen struggled to pull herself along the ground using her arms and feet to reach the safety of her home and call for help. She then crawled back to Cole to inform him that assistance was on the way. After waiting for some time, Helen crawled back to her house and dialed 111, the emergency number. As darkness fell, the dispatcher advised her to remain indoors. Helen later received the George Medal for her bravery, but help arrived too late for Cole, who died in the hospital. The first police officer on the scene was Sergeant Stuart Guthrie, the officer in charge of the Port Chalmers Police Station, and a non-commissioned officer in the Armed Offenders Squad, AOS. Armed with a Smith Wesson Model 10 police revolver, uncommon for New Zealand police in 1990, he enlisted the help of Constable Russell Anderson, who had arrived shortly before with the fire service. Guthrie provided Anderson with a rifle belonging to a local resident. As darkness began to fall, the 2 officers moved through the township toward Gray's house. Guthrie positioned Anderson to cover the front while he took position at the more hazardous rear. Shortly after, Detective Paul Knox and 2 additional constables arrived, initiating the first phase of the police strategy for dealing with armed offenders. Cordon, contain, appeal. Guthrie monitored Gray's movements inside of the house and communicated them to the police communications center. After a while, Guthrie lost sight of Gray and advised the detective to alert everyone to stay vigilant. Anderson then spotted Gray exiting the front of his property and issued a challenge, prompting the gunman to retreat quickly through the back. Taking cover in the sand dunes of a nearby crib, Guthrie encountered Gray emerging from the darkness. He shouted for Gray to surrender and fired a warning shot. Gray responded with, "Don't shoot," which led Guthrie to believe he was surrendering. However, Gray suddenly opened fire, hitting Guthrie in the head and killing him instantly. Minutes later, the Dunedin branch of the Armed Offenders Squad, AOS, arrived and established a roadblock approximately 250 meters down the sole exit road from Aramoana, securing the area with an armored vehicle. AOS units from Christchurch, Timaru, and Invercargill were also called in for assistance. The situation was deemed perilous, as Gray possessed a scoped rifle, which could allow him to shoot accurately from a distance. At this point, the police had issued orders for Gray to be shot on sight without firing a warning shot. Commissioner of Police John Jameson authorized the Anti-Terrorist Squad, ATS, now known as the Special Tactics Group, STG, to travel to Dunedin to locate Gray. Members of the group were in Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland at the time. Unable to secure transport with the Air Force, they took an early morning business flight on the 14th, bringing along Heckler Koch MP-5 submachine guns, which posed some challenges for a transport on a commercial aircraft. Also on the flight were Minister of Police John Banks, the Commissioner, and Julie Holden, who provided the ATS with information about Aramoana. A large contingent of reporters met the flight upon its arrival in Dunedin. A bus then transported the ATS to Port Chalmers, which was congested with vehicles, where residents from Aramoana briefed the team about their township in Grey. The ATS conducted a reconnaissance flight over the area in an Air Force Iroquois helicopter, initially flying at a high altitude for safety, as it lacked armor against small arms fire. Grey had previously fired at a private news helicopter that morning. The crew later performed low and slow passes over wooded areas where Grey was believed to be hiding. They carried armed police and dropped tear gas grenades in an attempt to flush him out. The Iroquois crew supported the operation for over 8 hours, including positioning police snipers in the surrounding hills. After the initial reconnaissance, the ATS split into 2 squads and joined the Timorese, who were already in position. The group received fire orders stating that if Grey had a firearm, he was to be shot. Meanwhile, Grey had entered a nearby crib, eaten a small meal, and gone to sleep. Some members of the ATS from Christchurch entered Aramoana around 6 a.m. on November 14th. They first approached Grey's house, passing bodies in the street. After clearing neighboring homes, they deployed a stun grenade into Grey's house, shattering the windows, followed by tear gas. When they kicked down the door, they found the house empty. The team then moved down the road, checking each house with 1 squad on either side of the street. They called in AOS units from Wanganui, Palmerston North, Napier, and New Plymouth for support. During their search, they found Sergeant Guthrie's revolver in a garden and a woman who had been hiding under a table for over 20 hours. After a long day of searching, the ATS checked a crib with a broken window on the northeastern side of the township. The crib was flanked by large hedges and had a fiberlight shed at the back. They briefly spotted Grey at a window, and a confrontation ensued. Police threw a stun grenade through a window, but it bounced off a mattress Grey had used as a barricade and landed nearby. They fired tear gas into the crib, but Grey began shooting not at the police, but through the fiberlight shed. The ATS returned fire, with both sides exchanging shots for about 2 minutes as Grey moved around inside, firing randomly. A stray bullet from the exchange struck an ATS officer in the ankle. As the gunfire erupted, an Air Force Iroquois helicopter positioned itself overhead to prevent Grey from escaping into the nearby bushes as darkness fell on the second night. At approximately 5:50 p.m., Grey burst out of the house, firing from the hip and shouting, "Kill me! F***ing kill me, you bastards!" He took several steps before being struck and brought down by ATS gunfire. Grey sustained 5 gunshot wounds to the eye, neck, chest, and twice in the groin. Despite these injuries, he fought vigorously against the police, managing to break free from plastic handcuffs before being restrained again, all while yelling at the officers for not having killed him. Ambulance personnel treated him at the scene and administered oxygen during the transport to Dunedin Hospital, but the ambulance barely made it out of Aramoana. At 6:10 p.m., Grey succumbed to his injuries. Inside the crib, police discovered a .22 Winchester rifle equipped with a silencer, an AR-15 rifle, an air rifle, hundreds of rounds of .22 ammunition, and around 100 rounds of .223 ammunition. At the time he was shot, Grey was carrying a .22 Remington rifle along with the .223 Norinco. Police fired between 50 and 60 shots during the incident, which involved at least 150 officers. In the aftermath, the charred bodies of Rewa Bryson and Jasmine Holden were found in the remnants of the Holden family home. Ultimately, 14 individuals, including Grey, lost their lives as a result of the incident. David Malcolm and Grey. The perpetrator was born on the 20th of November 1956, an unemployed resident of Aramoana. Born in Dunedin, New Zealand, Grey was raised in Port Chalmers. His father, David Francis, worked at a manufacturing company, while his mother, Mary Elizabeth, was a machinist. He had 2 siblings, a sister named Joan and a brother named Barry. Grey attended Port Chalmers Primary School and later enrolled at Otago Boys High School, from 1971 to 1973, where he was an average student. A former classmate described him as quiet and unremarkable, noting that there was nothing frightening about him then. Those who knew Gray recalled that he had always been a loner since primary school. He had worked sporadically as a farmhand, but had been unemployed for several years before 1990. Both of Gray's parents had passed away, his father in 1978 and his mother in 1985. His sister mentioned that their mother's death significantly impacted David, leading him to move from Port Chalmers to the Gray family holiday home in Aramoana. Gray was a frequent customer at Galaxy Books and Records on Lower Stewart Street in Dunedin. The store owner, Bill Brosnan, knew him for 7 years and noted that Gray was a fan of military literature and Soldier of Fortune magazine. In January 1990, Gray threatened a shop assistant with what appeared to be a shotgun concealed in a cardboard box, prompting Brosnan to issue him a trespass notice in February. His sister described him as an animal lover, a trait that reportedly created tension with his next-door neighbor, Gary Holden, whose pets frequently died. Gray's mental and physical condition deteriorated in the months leading up to the attack. There were signs of a gradual decline in his mental health, as he increasingly isolated himself from the few friends he had. On the morning of November 13th, he traveled to Dunedin, where he visited a bank and angrily objected to a NZ$2.00 fee for a check. He then went to Ilio's gun shop in King Edward Street, South Dunedin, where he placed a $100 deposit on a gun he planned to pick up the following week. At the Continental Coffee Bar, after being served a cold pie, he became confrontational. When asked to leave, he threatened the owners, saying, "I'll be back, I'm going to get you, I'll blow you away." 3 days after the massacre, Gray's house at 27 Murray Street in Aramoana was deliberately set on fire and completely destroyed. The Port Chalmers Fire Brigade responded and extinguished nearby vegetation to prevent the fire from spreading, while around 50 residents watched and reportedly laughed as it burned. When contacted by police, Gray's relatives requested that any arson investigation be halted. The massacre remains the deadliest criminal shooting spree in New Zealand's history.